welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome back to our morning briefing series after the summer break. My name is Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Kaiser Forum, a new initiative at DGAP for strategic questions to be launched this November. Today, we are looking at Ukraine once again, and at the state of negotiations between Washington, Moscow, and Kyiv. The war that President Trump once promised to stop within 24 hours is still raging more than 6 months into his presidency. This past week, we have seen a number of Russian attacks, including a strike on the 28th of August that killed 23 people, at least, including 4 children, and damaged the EU's delegation office in Kyiv. Overnight, air raids with drones and missiles have affected the entire country, including Lviv in the west, as well as also prompting the Polish air defense, in fact. Trump said yesterday that he was, quote, very disappointed in Putin, as yet another deadline passed without any direct talks between Putin and Zelensky. Instead, the Kremlin keeps insisting on its familiar line, demanding that so-called new territorial realities must be recognized and that Moscow somehow be part of post-war security guarantees to Ukraine, which is hard to imagine. Meanwhile, the Europeans are working on security guarantees themselves. President Macron and Prime Minister Starmer are due to chair a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing today. So how long will the road to peace be? Why is it so hard to get Putin and Zelensky to the negotiation table? And what are Europe's options, if any, to contribute to a speedy end to this deadly conflict? To discuss these questions, I'm delighted to introduce 2 familiar speakers in this series. First up, with the military update, will be Dr. András, Rácz, who's a senior fellow at DGAP's Center for Security and Defense, and a co-founder of the morning briefing series, I might add, a frequent contributor on all things military, who held prior positions at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki and the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs in the GMF, amongst others. Welcome back to the morning briefing, András.
Thank you, Jan.
Next up will be Rachel Tausendfreund, who's Senior Research Fellow for USA and Transatlantic Relations at DGAP and was previously a Senior Fellow and Editorial Director at the GMF. She's also a frequent guest on the morning briefing, so welcome back, Rachel.
Thanks for having me.
And let me add that Rachel is doing this just before another event, so she will have to run off just before 9 o'clock. So we'll make sure to channel any questions to her as quickly as possible. Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. As per usual, we'd like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We'll kick off our conversation here on the panel with about 4 to 5 minutes of intro remarks each, and then open up for questions as soon as possible. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand, digitally or otherwise, and when invited to speak, keep it relatively brief so we can pick up as many as possible. Finally, a word of thanks to all my colleagues supporting the DGAP morning briefing series, including Helga Beck, Lady Tran, Paul Jeker, and some others. Now, without much further ado, over to you, András. What's the situation at the front line in Ukraine?
Thank you. Good morning to all of you, and thank you once again for joining us today morning. Regarding the situation on the front lines, one needs to separate the 3 domains like air, sea, and land. When it comes to the sea, the bad news is that Russia has become able to serially to produce naval drones, naval attack drones, and last week, one Russian naval attack drone successfully attacked and sunk one of Ukraine's last remaining warships at the Danube Delta. So now comes the question, how does Russia intend to use these naval drone capabilities and whether they want to try hampering Ukraine's maritime export, because once this starts, it will pose an additional challenge both for Ukraine and the West to keep the shipping lines open. So this is about the sea domain. When it comes to the air war has intensified during the last weeks, as Jan rightly stated about the missile strikes and drone strikes. Both sides, both Ukraine and Russia, have been intensifying the air war, but with different objectives and different tools and means. Russia, as Jan said, has been consistently attacking the entire territory of Ukraine, and besides attacking military and infrastructure targets, from time to time, they deliberately target also civilian infrastructure and sometimes even residential buildings. Not to mention the very important attack on the 28th of August, when Russia hit not only the EU representation in Kyiv, but also the building of the British Council, showing an apparent open disrespect to any kind of European negotiation efforts or participation efforts in the negotiation process. When it comes to the Russian attacks in the air, they are focusing primarily on drones. Russia has been rapidly increasing the speed of drone production. By the end of the year, they might be able to reach the 5,000 drones per month production capability, including both attack drones and decoy drones, so the G9s and the Gerberas. So the main challenge for Ukraine is how to defend herself against such massive waves of drones. The problem is not only the amount, but also the price. Even an updated G9 drone costs less than $40,000. So firing a $3 million Patriot at each and every one of them, it's simply just not cost effective. So Ukraine needs to develop other methods. Ukraine is experimenting with interceptor drones, many other means, but the sheer amount of the incoming drones poses a major challenge. Finally, on the land domain, during the last few weeks, Ukraine managed to more or less stabilize the front line at Pokrovsk. Ukrainian forces are advancing in the north at Sumy. Meanwhile, heavy battles have been taking place both at Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, and all around the Donetsk front line. Russia's summer offensive has not reached any of its desired objectives. Meanwhile, Russia suffered astronomical losses even by Russian standards. Still, before the rain period starts, at least some 6 to 8 weeks are left, which are suitable for larger scale land operations. The biggest battles are going to take place around Pokrovsk, and the fate of the city would define a lot also how the sustainability of Ukraine's defenses in the entire Donbass would develop. So in terms of land warfare, Pokrovsk is the place to watch. So that's it from me as a start as a military update. And if there are any questions either about the military side or the Russian attitude towards the negotiations, I'm happy to do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks, András, and we'll definitely come back to both of those aspects. But first, let me hand over to Rachel. Where are the negotiations now? What's the news, if any news? Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Jan. I mean, there's lots of news. The question is, does any of it have real substance? It was a sort of theater summer, lots of summits and not a lot of outcomes. That said, although it wasn't good, it could have been worse. So this is why it wasn't good. You know, coming into the Alaska summit and coming into summer, Trump had been putting pressure on Putin, had been talking a lot about a ceasefire, had been talking about his disappointment in Putin. He said an August 8th deadline. So there was mounting pressure. Also, the sanctions bill in the Senate has massive support. It's still sitting in the Senate because it's not clear if Trump wants them to pass it, which would implement secondary sanctions on many countries and really hurt Russia. So pressure had been really building ahead of the Alaska summit. And that pressure is now gone because at the summit, Putin managed to convince Trump to stop focusing on a ceasefire and instead focus on some big peace deal, and which puts us again in the position of sort of waiting to realize once again that Putin actually isn't interested in any of this, right? But it delays the pressure once again. And so, you know, Putin absolutely won the meeting. That said, things could have been worse, right? Putin didn't win in the sense of, you know, Putin and Trump agreeing on some kind of peace without Zelensky present, which some had feared. So that didn't happen. The meeting between Trump and Zelensky this summer, by all accounts, went very well. The meeting with Trump and the Europeans, although the optics were annoying from a European standpoint, right? You had Trump behind the big desk and all the Europeans sitting in front like, I don't know, school children. And this is very much the message Trump wants to portray. So this was an annoying meeting, but it ended without any problems, which we have to consider to be good. And strangely, instead of doing secondary sanctions on people buying Russian oil, what we do have is tariffs against India with the rationale that they buy Russian oil. So it's a very mixed signal, but it does mean that there's still this idea in Trump's head and in the White House that, Russia's a problem, people buying Russian oil is a problem. And I didn't mention that, there were big weapon shipments as well. So in the end, all these big summits didn't really lead to anything, but we're not worse off than we were before, other than the hopes for a ceasefire in the very near future have been put on ice.
Thanks, Rachel. And let me invite everyone to come forward with questions and comments straight away, since we only have a short amount of time today. But Rachel, if you had to put your money on some date, when do you think this war is going to an end? I mean, we've had these talks in Saudi Arabia in February. We've had the so-called ultimate peace proposal in April. We've had the Alaska meeting in August. So what do you expect? Where is this going to lead?
I mean, the problem with that is I think it would need a Russia expert to answer that question, because in the end, it's not going to be decided by the US. It's going to be decided by Putin. Worst case scenario, we get what Marco Rubio was threatening before, where the US, Trump gets so annoyed by the inability to make progress that looks something like a peace deal that the US will walk away. And the bad version of walking away is that they fully walk away and stop the support of Ukraine. And that's definitely the worst case scenario. And that, I think, could happen. And whether that happens depends a lot on the Europeans and how the war progresses. But I don't see an end, certainly not in the next 6 months. I wish it were otherwise, but I just don't see Putin being interested.
Thanks, Rachel. I'd also love to hear from you on the potential of the US to help the Europeans, the so-called US backstop. What sort of potential the US has to help the Europeans in security guarantees? But we already have questions in the audience. Let me pick up a first question by Wilfried Gilge.
Yes, I hope you can hear me now. Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Wilfried Gilge is Associate Fellow at DGAP and expert on Ukraine and wider Black Sea. I have just been 2 weeks to Ukraine, including the 28th of August, and I would like at first to tell you that the Ukrainians do not see real negotiations. We cannot take the word negotiations. As long as Putin will make only 1 centimeter advancing, he will not be ready to negotiate. That is absolutely clear. And I think what we are now confronted with, and thank you, András, what you said, the Black Sea experts also advising Zelensky told us we are before maybe a sea drone war in the Black Sea region. That is absolutely on the table. So we have new challenges in the near future for Ukraine. My question, and maybe to Rachel, concerning the sanctions, it is not only that the sanctions, the package is in the Senate. The problem is that the US is fearing that the sanctions will not be effective as expected. And we also have to blame here Trump for that, because the OFAC, the Office for Controlling of Sanctions, has already been weakened. People has been dismissed by Trump. So the functions we have already have been not effective already as they have been before. And the second point is, and that was also a takeaway from Ukraine, the only sanctions that really will matter would be to find an international law-based mechanism to take out the tankers going through the Baltic Sea. All other things which are implemented by the European Union simply have no effect, because because any Russian tanker is simply not taking services in European ports. Therefore, price cap and all these things are simply do not work. And I think that is the main challenge. My question to András is, what I heard is also that the Russians are able now to produce 200 cruise missiles a month, 70 Iskander-M, so they could obviously promote their capacities to produce. How would you comment that? I mean, what types of missiles, and what does it mean for the future and for the Russian warfare? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Let me hand this over first to András, then back to Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you, Wilfried, and glad to hear that you made it safe back from Ukraine. When it comes to Russia's cruise missile and ballistic missile production capabilities, these two pose two different types of threats. Ballistic missiles are dangerous enough, but their range is comparatively shorter than of the cruise missiles. So the higher number of ballistic missiles means that the threats on Ukraine's eastern and southern regions, including actually Kyiv, so the regions within range for ballistic missiles, is about to grow a lot more. And one also needs to add the North Korean ballistic missiles, the KN-23s. And against the ballistic missiles, only very few air defense systems are efficient. All of them are provided by the West, the German IDSTs, the Patriots, and the French, Italian SMPTs. Basically, these are the three ones that are able to take down ballistic missiles. So Ukraine will continue needing a lot more of these, both launchers as well as missiles themselves. With cruise missiles, they are less dangerous a bit because they are slower, easier to intercept, but their range allows Russia to cover the entire territory of Ukraine, including Lviv, including Ivano-Frankivsk, including even Zakarpattia, which was the safest region of the war until August this year, that several Russian cruise missiles hit actually an American enterprise in Zakarpattia. There was a massive factory of Flex Electronics, a US company near Munkachevo, and the coordinated Russian strike completely obliterated the facility. This was another signal from the Russian side for the apparent disrespect of any kind of US efforts to negotiate or to facilitate a peace process. In a targeted strike, they destroyed an American-owned enterprise in Ukraine, basically as a test. So, Mr. Trump, here we go. What do you do about this? So with the cruise missiles, they're easier to intercept, but their range makes them dangerous for the entire territory of Ukraine, meaning the regions that were comparatively safer earlier are much less safe nowadays.
Rachel.
Yes, I mean, so you have sanctions and you have secondary sanctions, and we have the problem that the sanctions are, for various reasons, not as effective as we wish they would be. Part of that is just sanctions are most effective when really everyone participates. And we have major players, India, China, but many others, who are not participating in the sanctions, which means they're less effective. And also, those people who place the sanctions sort of pay, and others get then cheaper oil or gas than they normally would. Secondary sanctions have more teeth, but they're not uncontroversial. There's a lot of political cost to it. And with, for example, India, although Trump doesn't seem to care about India, even though the US has spent 30 years trying to sort of improve relations with India and build that partnership. But there are certainly others who worry about the sort of political implications, as well as you mentioned, the ability to enforce these things given the hollowing out of the state. So that's part of the problem with sanctions. You really have to be sure they're going to be very effective if you want to take on this, political cost, and you have to know what you want. And both of those things aren't really assured in the US politics vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia right now.
Thanks, Rachel. Can I ask you to comment on the security guarantee question?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's an important question. So I've maintained for quite a while that I'm confident that the US would offer sort of background support for a reassurance force or whatever we're calling it these days in Ukraine after a peace deal or a long-lasting ceasefire. And that though demanding it and demanding some kind of like Article 5 protection for Europeans in Ukraine is absolutely the wrong way to go about it. And the question mark is always Trump. So it's actually a really good sign that Trump himself recently said that the US would offer, air support. I forget what else he mentioned, but sort of, vague air support. And I think that's the point. I mean, what they would want to do is not have any obvious US presence. Now, non-obvious US presence, we have non-obvious US presence in a lot of places. And so they wouldn't want any obvious US presence, and they would want the Europeans to commit without a formal Article 5 support. And this is political, but it's also partially this idea of the Europeans having some real skin in the game and not this thing of we only care if also the Americans care. So I think the Europeans should assume that the US will be there for, specific strategic capabilities. I mean, reconnaissance, air support, air refueling, all of this kind of stuff, all of the stuff that the Americans can do that the Europeans can't really do without the Americans. I think the US will be there. But it's got to be the Europeans who are obviously out front on this, who are on the ground and who are the ones talking about positioning a security force. And then the Europeans are the background support, or the Americans offer background support. I think one should assume that that would be the policy of a Trump administration. Trump's the weak link there, but the rest of his administration would very much support that kind of a deal.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. That's interesting. I know you have to run off in a few minutes. Perhaps we can squeeze in a short question, if it's a question for you, Rachel, from Klaus Wittmann. Over to you.
Good morning. I remain convinced that for Putin, diplomacy is part of warfare, that he pretends readiness for negotiations, that he's playing for time, and that he is making Trump look very weak. And I think he will only move if he is faced with the real prospect of defeat. So I would like to know what you think about that, and will there be any chance that President Trump ever realizes this position of Putin? And a second point, I think there will be no effective security guarantees as long as Putin thinks he can win this war, because any of such arrangements would have to be negotiated and agreed. You cannot just march into Ukraine with a kind of reassurance force. So what is not possible to agree between the parties and with the international community has no chance.
Thanks a lot. Perhaps, Rachel, just a word on does Trump get Putin and his negotiation tactics?
Yes and no. So there were signs that Trump was getting annoyed and was suspecting that Putin was playing him. There was a funny quote in summary. He said, "I'm very disappointed in Putin. He talks so nice, and then he and then he keeps bombing," something like this. So Trump seemed to be getting it, and then at the summit, though, Putin was able to convince him otherwise and play him once again. So I think there's a risk. There's a genuine risk that Putin will overplay his hand and Trump will get too annoyed at some point, and then take the consequences. But so far, when Trump has gotten close to too annoyed, Putin has been smart enough to correct it. So it's possible. one would think after 3-4 times it would stop working, but remains to be seen. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Rachel, for joining us. I know you have to run off now, but perhaps András, you want to come in and say a few words on the mechanics of security guarantees and some of the other questions that were raised.
Thank you. And before I do that, a few things on the Russian side and the Russian motives. As General Wittmann rightly stated, what Putin is doing and what the Russian diplomacy is doing now, in fact, there is nothing new. This has been the old Russian, Soviet, and even Imperial Russian tactics that negotiations are part of the military effort. So negotiations are conducted not in order to find a compromise solution, but to advance and to help the military effort. In this particular case, negotiations are intended to drive a wedge between Ukraine and the West, drive a wedge between the US and Europe, and also make Trump annoyed and at a certain point just leave and abandon the whole Ukraine story. And how do we know that Russians are not serious? Dear colleagues, and many of you participated in this back in your time, we know exactly how Russians do negotiate when they are serious. Remember the negotiations in the early 1990s. Some of you participated in it. I just read that in the archives. Or something newer, remember the negotiations on the New START agreement. When Russia really wants to have a deal, they negotiate in a very efficient, very professional way, with all the tools and means of Russian diplomacy put into the game. Right now, they are doing something else. Incoherent messages, several efforts to confuse the other side, constantly varying objectives, constantly varying circumstances, and keep bringing up newer and newer obstacles. I mean, what Putin said yesterday, that, okay, I'm happy to speak to Zelensky, he should just come to Moscow. This is not a realistic objective, and Russians know it very well. So here, unfortunately, I need to agree both with Rachel and also General Wittmann that Russia is not about to seek a negotiated solution. Comes the question why? And the answer is, the likely answer is that probably the information Putin gets from his own leadership tells him and makes him convinced that time is on his side and that the Russian army is actually winning this. We don't know what exact information he's getting, of course, but from his behavior, one may judge that he's convinced that eventually Russia can win this war militarily. And that's the problem. This is the perception we need to change. When it comes to the security guarantees, one needs to make a difference between, I mean, there are basically 5 different types of security guarantees. I'm not going to go through all of them, really just one sentence. Option number 1, Ukraine joining NATO. That's not going to happen. Second, Ukraine, again, becoming a nuclear country. Again, not going to happen. Everybody is counter-interested in that, so that's off. Third, the West sending enough forces to Ukraine to deter Russia from further attacking. Colleagues, this would require at least 250,000 combat-capable forces to be deployed to Ukraine. The entire Europe does not have such an amount of deployable troops, so that's also off. Option number 4, bilateral security and defense guarantees given to Ukraine, something like Japan has from the United States. So no NATO membership, but some Western nuclear powers would take up the pledge to fight for Ukraine if necessary. Again, unlikely to happen. Which leaves us with the 5th variable, Ukraine armed to such an extent by conventional means that the Ukrainian army itself would be able to function as a deterrent in the future. Out of the 5 variants, this is the only one that may even be theoretically feasible. So that's my thinking on the security guarantees. And when it comes to the peacekeeping or any kind of peacekeeping forces, again, some of you have done this live when you were active. The largest ever peacekeeping operation of the post-Cold War era was Bosnia, the I4S4 mission. On the top period of the I4S4, the entire contingent was something around 82,000, including the forces in Italy. So altogether 82,000. The Ukrainian front line is at least 3 times bigger. We just don't have the necessary amount of deployable forces. So most of the fighting will still have to be done by the Ukrainians. The best Europe can do, and I'm very glad to see actually that the coalition of the willing seems to be on the right track. The best Europe can do is to contribute to Ukraine's military efforts by equipment, financing, ammunition, training, some certain specialized capabilities that Ukraine does not have, but sending fighting troops on the ground, unfortunately, I mean, this is not an option that we really have.
Thanks, András, for these extensive comments. And I think by commenting on both the security guarantees and also the style of Russian diplomacy, you sort of answered the questions in the chat by Helmut Ganser and Steffen Schumacher, respectively, though feel free to come back on those. I wanted to ask, since you mentioned earlier the Russian losses, I think you said they were astronomical even for Russian standards. What does that mean for the Russian war apparatus and the war economy? The Russian effort, Russian losses. Any comment on that, András?
Sure, certainly. When it comes to the Russian losses, we need to make a distinction between human losses and equipment losses. In terms of equipment losses, Russia has mostly run out of the modern heavy weaponry. You don't see T-80s on the front line. You see very, very few T-90s. You practically don't see self-propelled artillery anymore. Russian Navy also suffered losses. Russian Air Force also suffered severe losses. But I remember sitting here actually in the morning briefing 2 years ago when we estimated the speed of Russian losses, and if losses continue to occur with the same speed, how would this affect Russia's military effort? 2 years ago, we calculated that Russia could last, with the losses going on in the same speed, around 1.5, 2 years maximum. However, the nature of the war changed. Right now, and already for a year, the battlefield has been saturated by drones so much that any kind of larger scale mechanized operation is simply impossible. I mean, the largest scale mechanized operation we've seen in the last 2 years was Ukraine's operation in the Kursk region, and even that one was conducted only by a few brigades. So drones make it impossible even to group the forces necessary for any kind of larger mechanized operation. Drones destroy heavy weaponry way before that heavy weaponry reaches the front line, if we speak about larger contingents. Which means that even though Russia's heavy weaponry losses are severe, under these new circumstances, I mean, in this new changed type of warfare, this matters less and less. They don't need tanks as much as they needed them 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So yes, heavy weapon losses are severe, but because of this changed nature of warfare, Russia can maintain the military effort at least for 1.5 years more certainly. Plus, there are, of course, known and unknown variables to this. Human losses are more interesting. And there are, of course, methodological hardships. Still, what Ukraine communicates about more than 1 million neutralized Russian troops, including killed, wounded, captured, and missing. There is a bit of exaggeration in it, but not much. So the numbers that Ukraine publishes on the Russian losses, in terms of trends, they are correct. Still, Russia can endure this speed of losses, human losses, for a considerable while more. And I mean, most of the Russian troops are sent to the front line based on recruitment. Sometimes forced recruitment, sometimes people are tricked into the army, but most of the Russian forces on the front line are there because they decided to be there and they go for the money. Most of them are recruited and they still get good money. So the motivation for the average Ivan Ivanovich for joining the Russian army and fighting in Ukraine is financial. Russia can maintain this financing for quite a while more, and even if it would run out, or even if they would run out of men willing to fight for money, they still have the option to go for another wave of larger mobilization. So manpower is also not going to run out anytime soon. The quality of manpower is getting worse and worse. There are several indicators that this is not exactly the mercenaries and soldiers for fortune that Russia would like to have. But still, for the infantry heavy attacks Russia has been conducting, even these soldiers are good enough. Mm-hmm. So all in all, the weakest spot on the Russian side is their ability to finance the war. They are not going to run out of manpower. Their heavy weapon losses do matter, but not decisively. It's the money, it's the budget where they are the weakest. And the Russian economy has been suffering already for very, very serious problems. Mm-hmm. Open recession is about to start. A labor force shortage is an increasingly serious problem. I myself am not an economist, but DGAP always has the pleasure to work together with colleagues who are economists. So here I can wholeheartedly recommend, for example, Janis Kluge and also Finnish colleagues from the Buffett Institute who analyze in detail performance of the Russian economy. So that's a long story short. They can maintain the war effort.
Thanks, András. And indeed, there are foreign fighters as well. I read a report recently that the death toll of North Koreans has gone above 2,000 by now. So yeah, thanks for that overview. I think Wilfried Jürge wanted to come back in with a question, if that's right.
Yes, I only want to add what I got on security guarantees from Ukrainian military experts and stakeholders. And I think we have to very differentiate between support from the West when it comes to a ceasefire and peacekeeping troops. Any sort of peacekeeping, any sort of monitoring has to be internationally negotiated. So it cannot be a Western contingent. It can only be a neutral troop, and that it will be very difficult to find. But when we speak about how to assure the situation in Ukraine, Ukrainians expect at least that we will, for example, send instructors, that we will send people to make the training on the Ukrainian territory, instructors to help the Ukrainians to introduce NATO standards and NATO protocols in order also to reform the structures of the army. Ukrainians expect, for example, concrete protection of very critical infrastructure, for example, the Rivne nuclear plant in the North Ukraine, or other very difficult infrastructure things. So the Ukrainian side is aware of the fact that we will not go for, let me say, to send armed forces, at least in the second line. They are very clear of that, but they nevertheless say that any track, any presence of European partners who can take the burden, even when it comes to administrative and commanding structural things, can take any burden from the army which is standing on the front line, will be very helpful. So we should also think, maybe not, because I'm very skeptical about these guarantees, because we will not have any guarantee. What we at least will have is maybe a commitment, nothing else. I think the word of guarantee is also already misleading, because guarantee would mean something happens and then you have a response, but that will never happen. So we also have to speak, and that is also the takeaway from Ukraine, about realistic support which takes away burden from the Ukrainians standing on the front line. And what András said about the mobilization in Russia, it is also the turnaround true for Ukraine. The mobilization in Ukraine has changed. We have now people, we have mercenaries. So the time when volunteers joined the army is over, is over for a long time. We have now also in Ukraine mercenaries who need financial support, who need to be sure that the family are safe. And if we compare the incomes of Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers, there is a difference. And what the Germans, what the Europeans can also do is to finance in these mobilization structures to give also a stimulation for people in Ukraine to go to the army. That was also one takeaway from Ukraine. Thank you.
Thanks. Points well taken. Since we are coming to an end, and there's one more question from Klaus Wittmann, but I also wanted to ask you, András, as a sort of closing question, looking ahead. You mentioned 6 to 8 weeks until the rain period is coming. If you could just remind us of what the military situation might change like in the near future over the next weeks, and what the changing weather season might mean for things on the ground. And final question for Klaus Wittmann.
Yes, I only want to insist on one point. Even now, I think that Russia is not invincible, and the means is deep strike weapons with the permitted to use them against launching sites, military airports, cutting Russian supplies, and impairing Russian command structures.
Thanks. András, you have the final words. Over to you.
Thank you. What is going to happen in the upcoming 6 to 8 weeks? Russia will intensify the airstrikes again, also against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Plus, they would try to make a last final push in their summer offensive on Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, and basically this part of the Donbas front line. So this is where the heaviest battles are going to take place. Ukraine has to defend Pokrovsk. This is a city of key importance. If Pokrovsk falls, Russians would have the freedom of maneuver not to besiege cities of the so-called fortress belt from the north, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinivka. But if Pokrovsk falls, Russians would have the opportunity to cut off this fortress belt from the rest of Ukraine. So Ukraine has to hold Pokrovsk. Right now, Ukraine's best units are fighting here. They're even gaining back some territories, trying to soften or open up a bit more the Russian envelope around the city. So this is where the heaviest battles are going to take place. Plus, of course, the air. Ukraine is going to continue and intensify the war against the Russian oil sector. Solely in August, Ukraine managed to hit 17 Russian oil refineries, as well as a number of oil depots, the Ust-Luga oil terminal, and a number of other pieces of infrastructure. This is going to continue because Ukraine assesses that this is where it hurts the most for Russia. Ukraine's new weapons, including the Flamingo cruise missile and also a new ballistic missile, will make these strikes a lot more devastating. The colleague, just for the sake of comparison, most of the light drones Ukraine used against the oil refineries contain only a few dozens of kilograms of explosives, 20, 30, 50. So relatively small charges. The Flamingo cruise missile has a warhead of more than 1 ton. So that's a major piece of weaponry in terms of destructive power. So these attacks on the Russian oil sector are going to continue. And we will see to what extent Ukraine manages to hamper Russia's oil processing capabilities. Right now, the numbers that are floating around at 17% or 21% of Russians' refinery capacities are damaged. Colleagues, these are snapshots. So Russia continuously works on repairing the oil refineries, restructuring the product flows. So one shall not take this for something stationary. Still, the oil war will continue. And last thing, when the rain season starts, climate change is a major factor here. Even last year, the rain season started 2 weeks later than it usually does, and the ground did not freeze thereafter. So last year, we did not see, I mean, usually in Eastern European military history, there is the rain period, November, December, then the ground freezes from January on, and there are basically 2 months of solid ground, frozen ground, when it is possible to conduct larger scale land operations. Last year, it didn't happen. Last year, we had a 5-month long rain period, or like Schlammperiode. We don't know how it's going to happen this year, but still climate change is complicating the calculus. One thing is clear, however. With the cold weather coming in, the plants, the vegetation loses the leaves. And with foliage disappearing, there is much less cover against the drones, meaning losses caused by the drones will grow a lot, because for troops on the ground and equipment on the ground, it will be a lot more complicated to find cover against the drones of the other side. So this is the main effect of the incoming rain period. Ground operations will continue as slow as they are currently, but losses will grow because of the disappearing foliage. And as a kind of a last word, just as Rachel said, I also don't think that there would be any kind of functioning ceasefire in the upcoming 6 months, mostly because Russia does not want it. They will continue pushing on the military effort because they seem to be convinced that they could win this.
Which means that we will have to come back to this conflict and this war. Thank you so much, András. This was extremely insightful. Thanks also to Rachel, who's already running another event. Thanks to all of you in the audience, and see you back at DGAP and in the morning briefing series next week. Bye-bye.